Hello, everyone. I'm Vicki Healy at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and welcome to today's webinar co-hosted by the Clean Energy Solutions Center and REN21. Today, we will explore opportunities for citizens to contribute to help cities achieve the energy transition to renewables. One quick but important note before we begin our presentation is that the Clean Energy Solutions Center does not endorse or recommend specific products or services. Information provided in this webinar is featured in the Solutions Center's resource library as one of many best practice resources reviewed and selected by technical experts. So for the agenda, before we begin presentations, I will go over some of the webinar features and provide an overview of the Clean Energy Solutions Center. We will then proceed with a presentation by Ms. Leah Ronalder from REN21, followed by Ms. Alex Bolle from the EU Policy and Strategic Partnerships Energy Cities team. Then following the presentations, we will spend the remaining time addressing questions from our audience. Just a quick note to our audience, after the webinar concludes, a short survey will pop up on your screen, and we thank you in advance for taking time to answer a few questions about your impressions of this webinar. A few things to know before we begin. For audio, you have two options. You may either listen through your computer or over your telephone. If you choose to listen through your computer, please select the mic and speakers option in the audio box. And if you want to dial in by phone, select the telephone option, and a box on the right side of your screen will display the telephone number and an audio pin. Also, please note we have provided a copy of the REN21 Global Cities Report that you will find under the Handouts heading in the control box on your screens, and you are welcome to download this report. And again, just a gentle reminder to our panelists and to please mute your audio when you're not presenting. To illustrate the features that I just described a bit more clearly, we've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. So you should see something that looks like this in the upper right corner of your screen. When we come to submitting questions, we will be having a question and answer session. So please submit your text questions to the presenters by typing your questions into the questions panel. And you can see your questions, you can send your questions at any time. I will collect these, and Leah and Alex will respond to them during the question and answer session. So when you also submit your question, please include the name of the presenter you are addressing your question to. Today's event is being recorded, and if you would like to review the webinar or share this information with others, an audio recording will soon be posted to the Solutions Center YouTube channel. Also, you should receive an email within the next day with a link to access this webinar recording. Real quickly about the Clean Energy Solutions Center. It is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial, and the Solutions Center is structured to help governments design and adopt policies and programs that support the deployment of clean energy technologies. This help is provided through an Ask an Expert technical assistance service, which is offered to governments free of charge and is designed to allow our experts to respond quickly to questions. The Solutions Center also engages in capacity building activities, such as the webinar you are attending today. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters. First up today is Leah Ronalder, who is a project manager at REN21, the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st Century. And during her time at REN21, Leah has worked on and co-authored a number of reports, and she is the coordinator of the Renewables and Cities Global Status Report. Following Leah, we will hear from Alex Bolle from the EU Policy and Strategic Partnerships, where she is the policy decoder of the Energy Cities team. Her work focuses on analyzing how the EU agenda can translate into local opportunities for the energy transition. And so with those brief introductions complete, we will now move on to the presentations. Leah, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Also from my side, good morning for those of you logging in from somewhere else. It's my absolute pleasure, and thanks very much, Vicky, for that kind introduction, to introduce to you today some of these key findings of the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report that we launched last November, just before the COP. For those of you who don't know REN21, we are the only global renewable energy community of actors that brings together these stakeholders from science, international organizations, governments, NGOs, and industry. And the goal is really to enable decision makers to make the transition to renewables happen now. What we do is we have a whole broad variety of knowledge products. Some of you may know the Global Status Report that we've been publishing for over 15 years, our regional reports with future reports, and now since last year, this new reporting series, which is our Global Renewables in Cities Global Status Report. So that report is really the first annual stocktake of renewable energy in cities. It has 6 chapters. I'm not going to go through them in detail here. Everything is available online. But what I do want to highlight, though, is the fact that it is not me sitting in my little dark office and presenting and preparing this report. This is really an entire community of people behind that. There were over 380 people that were involved in preparing this report, either by contributing data, by reviewing the report, by helping us push it out. We conducted a lot of interviews. So this has really been a collaborative effort. And yeah, I really want to highlight this fact. So why cities? Why do we need to talk about cities when we talk about renewable energy? I believe cities are really key to advance this transition to renewables. Not only do they account for 2/3 of global final energy use, and are really also responsible for a significant amount of indirect consumption. So if we take into consideration materials being used in buildings and products that are being shipped to cities, but they also account for approximately 3/4 of CO2 emissions. We all know that more than 50% of the people live in cities, and we also know that this is, of course, expected to rise even further in the future due to urbanization and population growth. And at the same time, cities are huge financial and infrastructure hubs. So they really offer this lever to advance the renewable energy sector renewable energies in all sectors. Globally, we're really making great strides in the power sector, where renewables now account for 26% of all electricity. But we're really lagging behind in heating, cooling, and transport, and that's ironically where we consume most of our energy. So there's really a need to advance renewables in that sector. And if you look at those little yellow squares, that's the renewable energy share per sector. So cities can really accelerate renewables in the power sector on the one hand, and then they're also key to accelerate heating, cooling, and transport. In the building sectors, white wine, heating and cooling. In the buildings account for 50% of all heating demand, and of course most buildings are in and around cities. For heating and cooling, energy production tends to be more localized and thus occur closer to the point of demand. So there's really an opportunity to create urban renewable heating and cooling markets. For the transport sector, urban mobility is the primary source of urban air pollution. Urban transport accounts for 40% of final energy in transport. So cities really offer, can support this decarbonization by shifting, for example, their fleets to renewable energy fleets and reducing this overall demand for transport by promoting public transport, by reducing this overall need for transport, by improving walkability and bikeability of cities. So what we do see, though, is, why are cities advancing renewables? We see that cities are driven by a whole variety of different aspects. It's not only about climate change. It's really through the uptake of renewables, cities have the opportunity to create more livable urban areas and ensure a better quality of life. So this means ensuring healthy living environments, addressing air pollution, reducing municipal costs, local job creation, access to energy, everything of this while saving the climate, so to say. And we see that these drivers have translated into into ambitious targets. And these targets, so thousands of cities have committed to climate targets, but also to renewable energy targets for both the municipal operations, but also, and more significantly, to citywide renewable energy targets. We also see that 100% targets are really gaining traction, again, not only for city operations, but also for the entire citywide targets. And really importantly, these are not only targets in the power sector, it's also targets for heating and cooling and for transport and for all sectors. And to achieve these targets, we see that cities are playing multiple roles. On the one hand, so I will walk through these roles in a bit more detail now. On the one hand, cities can use their role as owners and operators of municipal infrastructure. That means really significant using this authority to scale up renewables in their municipal operations. So they can do this on the one hand on the consumption side, and on the other hand on the production side. On the consumption side, this means, for example, shifting to renewables for municipal operations, so procuring renewable power, procuring bioenergy or electric vehicles for the municipal fleet that really allow this integration of renewables. But then also changing away from this conception of only cities being energy consumers, but also being active energy producers. So really integrating solar PV and solar thermal on public buildings, on schools, on public housing, hospitals, shifting to renewable solar street lighting, and also making use of the urban activities, such as using waste and wastewater to really generate energy locally. And then, of course, the power of cities really goes beyond only the municipal operations. Cities have a role and a mandate to facilitate this transition really citywide. So that means to bring everybody on board, to bring other urban actors on board. That means businesses, communities, places of worship, citizens, so really everybody that operates, so to say, in a city. They can do this by, on the one hand, and these are of course only examples, using their role as regulators, so really using mandates and building codes to make the integration of renewables mandatory. We've seen this happen very often for new buildings. So that means, when the new buildings being built, okay, that required, now there's a mandate to integrate solar PV or solar thermal. But more interestingly, some cities are also now starting to integrate, to make this mandatory when there's a renovation happening. And this is, of course, then where it gets, especially from a European and North American perspective, really interesting, because that means how do you transform the entire already existing building stocks to make them low emission and to make them integrate renewables. And then, of course, also using fiscal and financial incentive to support this entire citywide transition. But then cities also play an important role in raising awareness about the benefits of renewables. So really creating this dialogue with everybody, again, that is operating in this urban environment. And then their power and authority and roles also goes beyond the cities. Cities can be trendsetters for pushing for higher ambition at national level, really inspiring other cities and also learning from other cities. And we've seen this in all these fantastic city networks that are doing great work and connecting cities, so cities can really learn from each other and also have a joint voice when going to the national level and even to the global level. Here, I do want to say that it's really important that that national level, because cities do not operate in a vacuum. That's very clear. Cities are part of a larger regional and national frameworks, supranational and global frameworks. So there's really a need to align policies between these different levels. For example, one is fossil fuel subsidies that exist at national level that of course influence city decisions. So it's really important that national and city level policies and action really align, and that everybody works together to achieve sustainability and tackle climate change. And because citizen participation is our topic here, I would like to dive into the last chapter of the report in a bit more detail. So we have an entire chapter dedicated to citizen participation. And of course, I'm looking forward to Alex going in a bit more detail on that topic as well. What we do see is that citizen engagement is really emerging as an important means of gaining public support and sustaining this momentum in the energy transition, as well as driving more ambitious goals at the national level. So how can citizens get involved in shaping this transition? Of course, here again, I mean, some of these things that I'm mentioning are not only specific to the urban environment, but of course also apply for everybody, whether they live in an urban or in a rural environment. One is consumer choice. So citizens can actively opt for renewables, which in turn has enabled energy companies to expand their renewable energy portfolio. For example, in the US, 5.5 million retail electricity customers have now opted for renewables. Citizens can also become prosumers. I mean, this can be individuals, individual households, or businesses that generate renewables for their own use. Of course, these models are more widespread in rural areas, but they're also increasing in urban areas, often facilitated by these policies and new business models that are popping up. And municipal governments can really play an active role in also helping citizens in their cities becoming prosumers. That means, for example, offering financial support, as the city of Cape Town is doing. If we look at Seoul, they have a feed-in tariff, they have some direct subsidies and leasing schemes. So that means over the past, I think, 5 years, more than 10,000 households have become prosumers just in the city alone. And then, of course, the community energy projects. Again, this has often been associated with more rural areas, but has also emerged in urban areas. And while Europe is considered to be at the forefront of this development, this has really, as Vicky will know, also been absolutely widespread in the US, in Australia, and New Zealand, Canada, Japan, and Thailand. And of course, also, I mean, this of course also depends on the supporting framework existing at the different levels of governance. City governments can support these initiatives and can support citizens, again, by providing fiscal and financial incentives for individual households, for businesses and communities. They can also allocate quotas for local ownership of new renewable energy projects, which is, for example, an approach that's quite widespread in Denmark. Municipal governments can also provide space. This is, for example, something that's happened here in Paris, where roof space on publicly owned buildings has been given to community energy projects. But I also need to mention, again, that in several countries, really these community energy projects do lack political support. So of course, it always depends really on the framework that is being given. And while citizen opposition to fossil fuel projects can also be a driver for renewables, opposition to renewables can of course also be a barrier. So participatory planning and governance tools to cater for these needs and preferences of local communities in renewable developments is really an important approach. So this approach supports gaining public trust by including all citizens in strategic and managerial decision making at the local level. And yeah, it also supports in tackling this not in my backyard issue. And because of course, if resident citizens feel like their decisions and their opinions are not being taken into account, that of course increases the likelihood of them objecting to renewable energy projects. So just quickly to wrap up before I hand over to Alex is what we've really seen here is that the nature of renewable energy empowers cities to become key players in the energy transition, that renewables offer cities the opportunity to achieve a wide range of objectives that go beyond climate change, that really also addressing local job creation, air pollution, access to energy, that cities have various roles in this energy transition, ranging from target setters to policymakers, really facilitating this exchange, and that cities are key to advancing renewables in all end-use sectors. What we've also seen in this report is that there's absolutely a need to strengthen the data on renewables in cities. The data situation is very difficult. And of course, why do we need data? The data is necessary to inform decision makers about what's happening at the city level, to really change this historic perception of cities only being energy consumers, but also showing what's happening in markets, in cities, in local markets, to really bridge this cities and energy debate, to bring this topic to cities, but also bring the topic of cities and the role of cities to this wider renewable energy debate, to track these advancements, and then, of course, again, aligning the policies across the national, subnational, and local level, all with the ultimate goal of empowering cities and increasing the awareness of their role in the energy transition. And maybe just as a shout out again is we've produced this report, it was published in November, but the idea is really to make this a continuous process. So if we want to track advancements, we need to have continuous data. So REN21 will produce the next edition of this cities report. And we're just starting. So this is an open invitation really to everybody here on the webinar to get involved, to really make this also your tool. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the debate and questions afterwards. And now over to you, Alex. Thanks.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you very much. I don't know if everyone can see my screen. Hope it's working properly. Just would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity, for giving us the opportunity to share our findings today about how cities can enact better policies in terms of citizen engagement in the field of energy and climate. And indeed, there are various ways to scale up renewable energy in cities, but let's say not all are equal in terms of impact. So we'd like to talk a bit more about how local authorities can develop these renewable energy strategies that directly involve and benefit local citizens. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I follow policy developments here in Brussels at Energy Cities. We are a network of about 1,000 cities across Europe that are engaged in the energy transition. We cover cities of all sizes, from small municipalities to big European capitals. And we try to advocate, at least here in Brussels, for a better legislative framework to support cities' climate and energy ambitions. And it turns out that recently we have seen that a lot of them have been keen to link their projects and policies more closely to the issue of citizen participation. So this is something that we have observed as very high on cities' agendas. So there are numerous reasons why cities are giving this a political push. One reason I would say is the pressure that they're seeing from students and citizen movements for greater climate action, and their wish to be also involved in finding the solutions. Obviously, there is the city's awareness of the facts of all the additional economic developments of projects that are sort of community-based in terms of the local value added creation when they are carried out by local stakeholders versus private large multinational companies. But beyond purely energy and climate considerations, we see that local elected representatives are also seeing energy democracy as a way to provide answers to citizens' growing disillusion with the political system and the establishment. So they're enacting more inclusive and participatory policies based on the notions of commons and social justice, etc. So we really see a number of reasons why cities are getting more and more interested in getting active on this topic. So over the past few years at Energy Cities, we have been following this topic very closely. And when we say energy democracy, we could give it a lot of different definitions, but we are approaching this via two angles mainly. So one is the fact of involving citizens upstream very closely in the design of energy and climate policies. And the second is to directly initiate or support citizen energy projects per se. So we have lobbied intensively at European level for the right framework to be set up, and we are quite happy with the results. So let's say that for a long time, renewable citizen cooperatives have been sort of coexisting with traditional market players, but they were most of the time facing unfair competition in spite of all the additional benefits that they were bringing to the local communities. And beyond typical citizen cooperatives, a lot of different models have started to emerge, with citizens teaming up with local authorities, with social housing associations, through foundations, with SMEs. And we see really like a very heterogeneous ecosystem emerging, which has led to the use of the term community energy, which is sort of a vague term, has been a vague term for a while and maybe remains so. But now it's actually a defined concept in European legislation. So with the adoption of two new pieces of legislation on electricity markets and renewable energy, the European Union has finally given a definition to the concept and has linked it to a number of criteria to help energy communities to have a fair access to all energy markets and benefit from a supportive framework. So the legislation recognizes the right for SMEs, but also local authorities to participate as shareholders. And it calls on member states to build cities' capacities in order to scale up energy communities. So I know we have a very international audience, but I think it's quite interesting to see what has developed at European level and the fertile ground that this is now providing to local authorities to directly join energy communities or support them in various ways. We have produced a sort of best practice guide to provide an overview of all the strategies and methods through which cities can support citizen participation in general. So as a first driver, they can take, so they can act, as a political enabler and take the political commitment to support citizen energy and adopt related programs, regulations, and policies in their local or regional strategies and action plans. So this can go from sort of large scope initiatives like the organization of dialogues with citizens on energy and climate policies, to the implementation of, for example, participatory budgets where residents are allowed to vote on climate and energy projects that they would like to finance. We know that this is something that the city of Paris has done. In Grenoble, which is one of the only large city, actually the only large city in France to have a green mayor. They have also launched a series of initiatives like that, and it is something that is getting more popular in Spain also. But it can also be, as you mentioned, Leah, objectives more related to energy production, such as supporting a concrete target to quantify in megawatts or as a percentage the renewable energy production capacity that should be owned by citizens within a certain time frame. And then also adopting specific criteria for public procurement is also a very strong method. So there is a local authority in Germany, in the district of Steinfurt, for example, which has identified community involvement as a key axis of their strategy to become 100% self-sufficient by 2050. So it's important to make the link between achieving the objective and relying on community energy to do that. In terms of targets, the region of Occitanie in France has pledged that in the next 10 years, by 2030, 100,000 citizens should be producing their own energy. So they have a target, they have a figure linked to this political objective. In Ghent, they had pledged that by last year they would have 50% of local renewable energy coming from being produced locally, and they're also calling on project developers to open 50% of their projects, of the capital of their projects, to citizen ownership. And I think it's interesting you mentioned, Leah, that we're not talking here just about the power sector. And so I'd like to give another example from Belgium, which is quite interesting. So it's just not about community wind or community solar. Here there has been a city in the north of the country that has included specific community energy requirements in its public tender for the construction of a large district heating network, which is actually said to be the biggest in the region, and for which they have required a minimum of 30% citizen participation. So this is very interesting. We're seeing this develop in a lot of different sectors, and cities are really moving fast on this. So we actually, this guide that we have made, we need to update it very regularly with new examples. So another obvious lever is support to financing. So that can be done through specific programs, like in Bristol, they have set up a citizen energy fund to provide loans for the startup phase of projects, or grants to cover the project development and operating costs. But that can also include non-monetary support. So cities, as Leah mentioned, can provide access to land space, public land, to roof spaces, but they can also provide human resource supports. We know typically that citizen cooperatives are often based on volunteering or lack internal expertise. So they can there provide administrative support to help identify grants, for example, work around certain legal obstacles, help with the project structuring, with the identification of partners, etc. So this is what the city of Ghent in Belgium has done by seconding municipal staff to support a smart grid project developed by the local cooperative on its territory. A third way is for cities to provide tools and guidance materials to support citizens. So I was talking about the local authority I was talking about earlier in Germany, where they have adopted the political commitment. Then they have declined this with concrete tools. So they have developed, they have created what they have called a service station to help citizens with any question they might have about wind energy. There are a lot of cities that are developing solar cadastre or heat maps, basically trying to map all the potential there is about local energy resources. So the picture you see is from the city of Lisbon, which has developed a very sophisticated tool on that, where citizens are invited to contribute. And you can find more information about that also on Energy City's website. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the fourth way is for municipalities to join or set up an energy community with citizens. They can do so in the field of energy generation, but the possible activities can basically span all energy services, from energy efficiency to storage, balancing, aggregation, etc. But what is important is that in the new definition provided by the European Union, there should be, so this new legal entity should be based on democratic control, meaning no shareholder should be disproportionate rights over another, and it should be based on the principle of one member, one vote, and on open and voluntary participation. The primary aim of the community should be to create local socio-economic value rather than maximizing profits. So I think the interest for a municipality to take part is also in terms of reaching out to citizens when a local authority is part of such projects or of a cooperative. It adds a sort of legitimacy to the whole thing. Like for citizens that would be hesitant to know that the local authority is involved is quite reassuring. So we are seeing more and more examples emerge, and when the European legislation will be properly transposed in all EU member states, this should continue. But we know already of I mean, I can mention an example also in the south of Belgium, in Moucron, where a municipality has teamed up with its local residents to develop an energy service sort of company that is helping households to install solar panel on their roofs, and is engaging now in a lot of other activities, including on collective self-consumption. So this is a bit the overview that I wanted to give you in terms of all the ways, the many ways to which cities can support energy democracy in the broad sense of the term. You can find more details in the publication that we have produced, and the link is on the screen. And I will be happy to take any question you might have. Thank you very much.
Leah and Alex, thank you so much for your presentations. They were really excellent and just filled with a lot of valuable and very meaningful information, so they were good to hear. I'm eager now to present you some questions from our audience, but there's one I'd like to start with, if it's okay. There's Leah, you mentioned the barrier that cities or even other, locations can have with this not in my backyard sort of challenge. And I was just wondering if you have some examples of where that challenge was actually met and overcome, and projects were actually able to be implemented by, having that community interaction to work with each other and show some success.
Sure. Thanks very much, Vicky, for moderating and for this question. I think actually that probably Alex has a lot better examples at hand than I do. But I think for me, I'm going to swerve off that question a bit because actually I don't have concrete examples in the back of my mind. So I hope Alex will help out. But I think for me, it really does boil down to this notion of a fair and just transition. How do we make sure that a transition to renewables really brings everybody on board? That it's not only a transition that's being brewed up in a dark corner by some executives or decision makers, but that everything around that transition is also transmitted to the citizens. Because one example for me is in Germany, a rather small town of Geildorf, where they had in the end, the city almost divided itself in half of opponents and people in favor of huge windmills that were going to, big windmills that were going to be built there. Actually, a pilot project, where it really turned into a turf war, where in the end, the city decided, okay, let's have a referendum on this. It turned out to be in favor of the windmills, but really, a lot of information, also assuring this entire bird question that, the habitat there will not be destroyed, that, this is how the city will benefit from this in monetary terms, but also in decision-making terms. I think that's a really interesting case. So I think, boiling it down to inclusive decision-making and making sure everybody's on board is really an important aspect. And I hope Alex has a couple more examples, maybe also to follow up on that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I think this is quite relevant. I think it's indeed very important, as you mentioned, the governance aspect of the whole thing, and for the citizens not to have the impression that the project is being imposed from the top down. So I think once there is already a resistance, it's probably already too late in the process in some ways. So I think this also reinforces the importance of what is indeed a community energy project and what should be behind it in terms of governance principles. So we're seeing more and more, like big utility companies trying to add to their project some levels of citizens' participation by, doing some crowdfunding, like adding some crowdfunding at the last moment. But I think this is often not sufficient, because the citizens need to be also involved in the governance of the project very much upstream. And this is now, with this new definition we have at the EU level, this is a requirement behind, falling within the definition. I think it's also important for citizens when they are not actually shareholders, because that helps. Something that's also important is for them to understand how, the project will benefit the local community. So when you see, citizen cooperatives behind these projects, you do see that they are reinvesting the money, not sending it back to distant shareholders, but they're reinvesting it in educational projects, in energy efficiency measures. you know, in community projects basically. So I think a good communication around the project itself and, you know, the benefits that will be driven out of it for the local communities is very important.
Maybe just to, you know, follow up on what Alex just said, and I absolutely agree. And you know, I can only recommend your handbook. I think it's fantastic when, you know, it talks about all these different tools and what cities can do to engage their citizens. So some promo for absolutely reading that handbook is, I agree. I mean, we've had, you know, talking about community energy, some really questionable definitions that were being used or being applied for making a huge large-scale project really go through as community energy project. So I very much welcome that there's now, you know, that in this EU directive, it's, you know, there's a definition, because I think that's very much necessary. And I would also say we as a renewable energy community and people, you know, working in that topic really need to work on showcasing examples of good citizen participation.
Excellent. I think, yeah, I couldn't agree more. Getting citizen input, you know, early and often is a great tool and necessary in order to move things forward. So thank you for those answers. Just a real quick reminder, I have a few other questions, but to our attendees, if you have a question, please go ahead and type that into the little box on your control panel that says questions. I've answered a couple of you privately, so please check and see if your question has been responded to. Real quickly, I think this question could be both for Leah and Alex. What is needed so municipal governments consider renewables as a real option for helping to meet social, environment, and economic objectives?
Thank you, Vicky.
Leah, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Well, I think actually, you know, as I was mentioning, we have a lot of members already working on this topic and keen to continue. So I think they actually do already for the most part. But as I mentioned, I think it's important for them to realize the economic opportunities behind community energy. So in terms of local value creation, in terms of, you know, creating shorter supply chains and how, you know, the money will stay within the territory to a greater extent when the project is community based. There have been numerous studies that have been testifying to that, and I would be happy to share some of them afterwards. So I think the economic case is a very important one. But I think another aspect is perhaps for local authorities also to feel encouraged and sort of emboldened to do that, because in, you know, when we're not talking about, you know, major cities, when we're talking about smaller municipalities, there is sometimes a risk that they would feel this is not, you know, this is not something for them, this is too complicated, this is outside of their remit, because basically, you know, with the decentralization of the energy system, it's, you know, new players are starting to get an interest in that traditionally haven't been working on this field. So it can be intimidating to begin with. So I think it's important to give trust to cities that they can actually do this, that they can actually, you know, become a shareholder, that they can support their citizens, that, you know, to develop their teams to do so, and for them to understand what's the potential. So there needs to be, you know, also good technical assistance. There needs to be also an enabling framework at national and federal levels. So, for example, what's happening in the EU now, if it's properly transposed nationally, this is something that will help them also, because there is, you know, a requirement on the EU member states to provide this capacity building to cities. I think capacity building, awareness raising are important elements, and also awareness of all the economic opportunities that can be derived from this.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think, you know, talking about renewables in cities as a wider topic, going beyond how to involve citizens, it's really, and I know I sound a bit provocative when saying that, it's really talking beyond climate change at the city level. I think cities in European countries, and to a certain extent North America and Oceania can maybe afford talking about climate change, but going beyond that, in my experience over the last months and years, has really been talking about other topics. Really is what does the trick in that sense. So really talking about renewables as an opportunity on the one hand, as Alex says, for economic, saving money, economic development, but also for, tackling air pollution, for improving energy access, for local value creation, tackling youth unemployment. I think this is, this is really, I think it's really important to highlight and stress these factors as well. And just as a little anecdote, I attended the World Urban Forum last week in Abu Dhabi, and energy is not a topic at all. It's really, our event was the only session on energy. So it's really important, like it's really interesting to see that, we really need to bridge that discussion between the cities and the energy debate, and also showcase how renewables can help achieving all of these other objectives that cities might have and are laying out for themselves.
Great, thank you both for those very good answers to the question. I have a question that has come in from one of our attendees regarding, I believe the question is asking if you have any examples in South Africa where citizens are working with and interacting with companies to support the energy transition to renewables. So working with businesses and companies.
Sorry, we work exclusively. No, it's just a word of apology because we're really like focused on the European landscape, so I wouldn't be able to help with that one.
I can say, I mean, in our report, we do have some examples on sub-Saharan Africa and citizen participation. As a general note, I can say that this is really an area where citizen participation, and especially also data on citizen participation in renewables in cities, is really poor. So I'd love to have more data, and this is actually one of the reasons why for the next edition we will have a focus on sub-Saharan Africa and cities in sub-Saharan Africa, and then of course we'll also be able to go into a bit more depth on that topic, and I'll take that as an inspiration. So unfortunately not a really good answer for you yet, but I can say stay tuned for in a year, and I hope to have a bit more answers for you then.
Terrific, great, thanks so much. Next question from one of our attendees. Do you think that the issue of energy sufficiency should be included in city energy master plans? What are your thoughts on that?
I can say for energy cities, I can say this is something that's very, very relevant. This is also something that we're lobbying for at European level, because we are seeing that there is a tendency, to work from a supply perspective rather than a demand perspective. Despite the Green Deal and despite the progress that we have seen so far, there is still a bias towards, going with proposed solutions, ready-made solutions, rather than, actually wondering what is it that we really need and how can we cut those needs. So clearly this is something that at city level is being done, and the cities are a good case, a great success story to base to inspire a more national and European and international sort of model based on how cities are doing it. So clearly this is something that they are already doing, and this is what we would like to see more at supranational level, let's say.
I mean, just to follow up, I absolutely agree. I think we see that happening, specifically talking about energy efficiency. That's usually very more dominant in master plans than renewables. And I mean, from a REN 21 perspective, really energy efficiency and renewables working hand in hand is absolutely necessary and should be incorporated in any master plan, whether at the local or at the national level.
Great, thanks so much. Next question. How do you engage citizens to ensure buy-in for renewable energy uptake? And to Alex, can you name some successful examples for other cities to follow?
Sure. Well, I think there too, it's a question also of raising awareness, and then the city has a key role to play there. There is, we see a lot of cities also implementing subsidy programs, because in many respects the problem is also, if we want to reach out to a broader range of citizens and go beyond what is called in Brussels like the dentist. The typical dentist story that will have the means to install the solar PV on their roofs, but to reach a broader range of citizens, we need to indeed, cities will need to provide some sort of subsidies or help with the upfront costs. But I think something that is also emerging as a solution is for citizens to realize that even if they don't have a suitable roof, or even if they don't have the means to put money aside for this, there are new kind of opportunities that are emerging, for example, around collective self-consumption. So where you would be able to join a community and benefit from the energy of your neighbor at a price that would be better than the one that's given by the traditional utility. So it's about also mainstreaming the models that are emerging now, in terms of we're moving away to the typical feeding tariff system, and trying to develop more innovative models where citizens can also benefit in different ways by cooperating with their neighbors, etc. So it's about raising awareness about all those opportunities, and for the cities also to play a role there.
Maybe just to also add on what Alex said, I think yes, cities and municipal governments really have this really important role with these fiscal and financial incentives to really make sure it's not only the wealthy people that can afford being part of this transition, but also adding on this raising awareness part is raising awareness, to get in touch with renewables in the first place. You're installing some renewable energy, some solar PV in parks or in city halls, something that's, so to say, to touch and to see and to feel, to also, show citizens and everybody that lives in that city how renewables look like, and give that information of how to get involved. I think that's a great way as well. And we've seen a lot of cities who are doing that really strategically, putting up projects integrating them into their landscape, and in strategically good positions, so to say.
Interesting. Great. Thanks for those great answers. Next question. How can city and national governments work together to ensure that local and national level policies are mutually reinforcing and aligned? Leigh, would you like to start with that one?
Sure. I mean, I think this goes a bit back to what I was mentioning beforehand. I think here one big point for me is dialogue. That city and national governments and regional governments really speak to each other. I think I've spoken to several city representatives, and they're like, well, yeah, this national government just passed this amazing, cool new legislation, but they need us because we produce 2/3 of the CO2 emissions. Do you think anybody ever gave us a call or informed us about what's happening? So I think this dialogue, communication, is one big aspect of how to improve this. And it seems really simple, but it's a bit it's often not being done. So I think getting all the relevant stakeholders in the room is, I think, an important first step for that, and then really mapping out what policies exist, knowing what policies exist, to really make sure that they are reinforcing each other and not impeding each other.
Sure, I completely agree with that. And I just maybe to give a concrete example on how this can be done, in the Netherlands, they have started a very ambitious process around this, which they have started back in 2013, where they have, initiated months of sort of negotiation process that has lasted over several months, including about 50 organizations, including local authorities, ministries, organization, NGOs, in a process of defining a common agreement for the energy future of the country, an agreement that was signed by all stakeholders, and they have been reiterating this process ever since. So sharing responsibility and commitment to achieve overarching objectives between different stakeholders. So this was called the Energy and Sustainability Agreement, and is very much a success story in Europe. And this is something that the European Union has starting also to emulate via its legislation. Again, they have issued a legislation on what they have called the governance of the energy union, where they have required that member states, European member states, establish permanent, actually indeed, dialogue structures with their cities, local authorities, and citizens on their long-term energy and action plans, so that these structures will not be a one-time consultation exercise where you just check a box and you're done, but actually a kind of recurring a dialogue structure. So I think this is very important indeed.
Great. Thanks again, Leah and Alex. That's we're coming to the end of our hour, but you have delivered some really fantastic presentations and addressed some great questions from our audience. So, thank you again for your participation and sharing your knowledge and expertise. Real quickly before we adjourn, if you have any final thoughts or remarks you'd like to make, I invite you to do so to our attendees. Sorry, Leah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. First of all, big thank you to you, Vicky, for hosting us and for organizing everything. I think, and of course to you, Alex, for your fantastic presentation, and also this amazing collaboration over the last year. I think for me, I'm gonna end up with the word saying data. I mean, really having good data of what's happening in cities and renewables in cities is super important to really understand the role that cities play in this energy transition. So yeah, better tracking, better decision making.
Thanks a lot to both of you, Vicky and Leah, to the organizers. I've been very happy to take part in this webinar. Have had very interesting questions. Would be happy to keep in touch with everyone and then continue these discussions. I think for me, if I have to have one concluding remark, I would say that the past few decades have been a lot about technology breakthrough. But now we have to really focus on the governance of how we make this right, and what governance models we invent now, what kind of hybrid partnerships need to emerge for this to be upscaled, really. So that would be my concluding remark, and thank you again for organizing this.
Thanks again to you both. And I'd like to close by extending a very hearty thank you to both of you, to Leah and Alex, and also to our attendees. We very much appreciate your participation, and we do hope that you found today's webinar valuable and that you are taking away some good information that is going to be helpful in your professional and personal lives. I do want to remind you that I did post a copy of the REN 21 Global Cities Report in the handout section of you'll see that in your control panel, and you're welcome to download that report if you'd like to have a copy. One last quick reminder, there will be a short survey that pops up after we end the webinar. And again, we appreciate you taking a minute or two just to answer these very short survey questions. So with that, I do wish you all a good day, and this concludes our webinar.